Officer Mason Hayes had a simple job: scare the locals, collect the payments, and keep anyone foolish enough to challenge his authority either locked up or too terrified to speak out. It had worked beautifully for nearly a decade. Every diner, auto shop, and corner store in Redwood Falls paid their protection fees. Every complaint vanished in the precinct's endless piles of paperwork. Every inconvenient witness suddenly remembered the value of silence. But all those neat little schemes are about to blow up, because Hayes just arrested the wrong person. A black woman who once led the deadliest Delta Force unit the Army had ever seen. Her name is Commander Ebony West, and she's back from a classified mission overseas. She thought she was coming home to bury her estranged father, but instead found herself tangled in a corrupt police empire. Now Redwood Falls is about to discover what real fear feels like when the most lethal soldier in the armed forces decides to take on an entire precinct single-handedly. And if you think Redwood Falls PD has secrets, wait until you hear what Ebony's been trained to do with nothing more than her bare hands and her unstoppable sense of justice. Just before we get back into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. Ebony West's boots hit the cracked pavement outside Redwood Falls Airport late on a Tuesday afternoon, the sun pressing low and a glowing smear of tangerine across the horizon. She'd been gone for 4 years, so the city's gloom felt sharper than she remembered, like a wound that never fully closed. She was here for a funeral, not a fight. At least, that was the plan. But Ebony had learned long ago that plans change, especially when corruption is on the prowl. She hailed a taxi, the driver eyeing her olive-green duffel bag with curiosity. She wore civilian clothes, but there was something about the rigid way she sat, the coiled tension in her posture, that broadcast her military background louder than any uniform could. Her dark hair was pulled into a tight bun at the nape of her neck. She stared out the window at the passing blocks. Graffiti covered the once pristine walls. Empty storefronts lined the main street. Ghostly, desolate. Everything whispered that Redwood Falls had lost its soul, or maybe it had been stolen. 2 miles before the cemetery, she asked the driver to pull over. She needed to see the family home, even if she couldn't bring herself to step inside yet. The house was a battered one-story structure, with chipped paint and a sagging fence. Her father had passed just a week earlier, and Ebony still felt the sting of never reconciling with him. She stood on the sidewalk for a full minute, duffel bag slung over her shoulder, trying to gather the resolve she usually reserved for combat zones. That's when she noticed it, a police car slowly rolling down the block, headlights off, like a predator stalking prey. She locked eyes with the officer behind the wheel. He didn't look friendly. She could practically smell the hostility. Ebony stepped back, letting the cruiser pass. Something about it crawled under her skin. Years of Delta Force training told her that Redwood Falls was under a different kind of occupation, one that thrived on fear and darkness, not foreign enemies. She turned away, deciding that facing her father's empty living room would have to wait. At the funeral home, Ebony was greeted by a soft-spoken receptionist who seemed relieved to see a new face. She signed a few documents, made final arrangements, and left within the hour. Under normal circumstances, Ebony would have lingered to pay respects, maybe talk to the funeral director about a small service, but her instincts buzzed with an urgency she couldn't quite name. Redwood Falls felt like a powder keg, and Ebony had never been the kind of soldier to run from a fight, especially not when innocent people were trapped in the middle. She checked into a modest motel on the outskirts of town, the neon sign blinking erratically in the dimming twilight. The clerk at the front desk barely looked up, more engrossed in a battered TV set that was running a local news report about an assault case involving Redwood Falls Police Department. Ebony caught words like excessive force and no comment from the precinct. She made a mental note to investigate further. After all, she had time before the funeral, but the next morning it became clear that Redwood Falls wasn't going to let her rest. Around 6 a.m., Ebony stepped outside her motel room, intending to grab coffee from the vending machine in the lobby. Instead, she found a young black man pinned against a patrol car, his arms twisted behind him, face pressed against the windshield. The arresting officer was Mason Hayes, the same one she'd seen cruising by her old street the day before. 3 other officers hovered nearby, smirking. The young man tried to speak, voice trembling. "I didn't do anything, man. You can't just—" Hayes drove a knee into the man's lower back, cutting him off with a grunt of pain. Ebony felt the pulse in her neck throbbing with anger. She'd spent her career fighting to protect her country, to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Now, on American soil, she was seeing the kind of brutality she'd been told was the hallmark of dictatorships abroad. Without conscious thought, Ebony advanced. "Back off," she commanded, voice cold as steel. She saw Hayes glance at her uniform boots, like he was assessing whether she was a threat. He didn't know the half of it. "This ain't your business, lady," he snarled, shifting his posture to stand between her and his captive. The other officers exchanged glances, hands hovering near their sidearms. Ebony's pulse pounded. She sized them up in an instant. 2 were overweight, probably more talk than skill. The third had a certain stance that said he'd thrown down before. Hayes himself carried an air of malicious confidence, the kind that builds when a bully has never been put in his place. Ebony's eyes locked on the man pinned against the car. His face was contorted in pain. She recognized the look of despair, of shock at how quickly justice can twist into cruelty. It stirred something deep within her, the memory of her own father's voice, scolding her for being too blunt, too aggressive in the face of authority. But Ebony had never been one to let injustice slide. "How about you step away?" she repeated, deliberately calm, and let him breathe. Hayes actually laughed. "Ma'am," he said, dripping with police business. "You're interfering with police business. Don't make me arrest you too." She unclenched her fists. The easiest path would be to let them finish their harassment, maybe film it discreetly, then file a complaint. But Ebony West had never taken the easy path. "You have a name?" Hayes asked, still pressing the young man into the car. "Commander West," she replied, letting the title ring in the humid morning air. "United States Army." His sneer faded slightly. "Is that supposed to scare me?" "It's supposed to let you know I understand protocol," Ebony said, stepping within arm's reach. She forced her body to remain steady, though every fiber of her wanted to floor this officer with a single strike. "And, I'm telling you, this is an illegal detention." Her words ignited something in Hayes. He let go of the young man just enough to whirl on Ebony. "You want a piece of this? Fine." He flashed a grin that made Ebony's stomach tighten with disgust. "Step over here, Commander." The young man's knees nearly buckled as the pressure on his spine released. Hayes grabbed Ebony by the arm, yanking her aside, and she allowed it just enough not to escalate the violence. She could take him down in seconds, but that would cost her dearly. Redwood Falls PD wasn't above fabricating charges. She'd seen it happen in other small towns while on leave, though never this brazen. "What's your name?" she asked the young man, ignoring Hayes' attempt to intimidate her. "Shane," he croaked, massaging his twisted shoulders once Hayes was no longer pressing into them. Ebony nodded. "Shane, I want you to go inside the lobby and wait there. I'll be fine." Hayes bristled. "He's coming with—" "No," Ebony cut in, raising a hand. "He's free to go unless you have probable cause to arrest him. You don't, do you?" She turned to face Hayes fully, letting him see the calm fury in her eyes. The other officers hesitated. They were clearly used to operating with zero oversight. But Ebony was a wild card, and they weren't sure how to handle her. Finally, Hayes spat on the ground and gave Shane a final shove. "Get the hell out of here!" Shane scrambled away, shooting Ebony a look of shaky gratitude before disappearing into the motel. Hayes flexed his hands. Ebony recognized it as a sign of aggression, the lead-up to a fight. She stood her ground, posture deceptively relaxed. She could end him in 2 moves if she had to. "You think you can barge into Redwood Falls, flash your big army rank and tell us how to do our jobs?" Hayes asked, stepping closer. "You have no idea what you've just gotten yourself into." Ebony's lips formed a tight line. "I've seen bullies in uniform before," she replied. "They're all the same. Lots of bark, and when the truth comes out, they whine like puppies." She expected him to lose it, maybe throw a punch, but instead he just smirked. You want to see how Redwood Falls handles outsiders? By all means, stick around. We'll be seeing you, Commander West. He and the other officers retreated to their cruiser, not even bothering to check in with dispatch. Ebony watched them drive off, her heart pounding. She'd encountered corruption overseas, but to see it here, blatant and unashamed, churned her gut. Redwood Falls was in the grip of something dark. She'd glimpsed it in the deserted businesses, the hush on the streets, the fear in Shane's eyes. An older man stepped out from a room 2 doors down, brows knitted in concern. You okay, miss? Ebony gave a curt nod. I'm fine. He nodded back, but his expression said otherwise. He slipped inside without another word, as though staying out of it was the safest choice. Ebony exhaled slowly and followed Shane into the lobby. The young man sat on a worn sofa, head in his hands. He looked up as she approached. Thank you, he whispered, voice unsteady. They've done this before. My brother, he tried to stand up to them and now he's... Shane shook his head, tears forming. He's in jail on some fake charge. I'm scared I'll be next. Ebony placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. I'm sorry, but you're not alone. I've got your back. Shane managed a hopeful nod. People around here are terrified. If you speak up, they plant evidence, twist statements, or worse. You can't fight them. They run everything. The mayor's office, the judges, half the businesses. It's like the city belongs to them. Ebony's jaw tightened. How long has this been going on? Shane swallowed. Years. My mom said it started small. Little bribes, hush money. Then folks started disappearing, or winding up dead in custody. But no one will do anything because the whole system's in on it. Her mind roiled. She still had to bury her father, but now she'd stepped into a war zone she never anticipated. Part of her wanted to leave it alone. Her military career had taught her that you can't fight every battle, but Ebony West wasn't wired to ignore injustice, especially when she could do something about it. Go home, Shane, she said softly. Stay safe. If they come after you again, call me. She scribbled her number on a slip of paper. He took it with trembling fingers. You're risking your own safety, he said, voice shaking with gratitude, or maybe fear. Ebony offered a small, reassuring smile. I've been risking my safety most of my life. Take care. After Shane left, Ebony felt the weight of Redwood Falls pressing in. She was only supposed to be here for her father's funeral, but a mission had found her anyway. This was the kind of fight she understood. Tyranny, thriving in the shadows, silencing the vulnerable. She headed back to her motel room, locked the door and let herself dwell in the swirl of emotion for just a moment. She wasn't an active-duty soldier anymore, but her skill set didn't vanish the day she took off her uniform. If Redwood Falls PD wanted a war, Ebony West wasn't one to shrink from it. Early the next morning, Ebony made her way to the cemetery for a quiet, solitary goodbye to the man who'd raised her. She placed a single white rose on her father's headstone. Regret gnawed at her. They hadn't spoken in over a year. He'd disapproved of her extended deployments, her relentless drive to be the best. She'd never gotten the chance to prove to him that all her sacrifices were for a greater good. Now he was gone, and Redwood Falls was the only connection left to him. After the cemetery, Ebony walked the few blocks to her father's house. The door creaked as she entered. Dust motes danced in the stale air. She flicked on a lamp and scanned the cramped living room. A wave of memories crashed over her. Summers spent watching football with him, arguments about her joining the army, the day she left for basic training and he barely said goodbye. She swallowed the pain, moving methodically through the house, gathering old photos, small mementos. She paused at a framed picture of her father in his postal service uniform, the one he'd worn for 30 years. He'd been proud of that job. A decent, honest man, Ebony thought, reminding herself that not all uniforms corrupt. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. They're looking into you, be careful. Ebony frowned, typing back a quick, who is this? She got no response. She guessed it might be Shane or someone else who'd learned about her confrontation with the cops. She pocketed the phone. Redwood Falls PD wasn't wasting time. She stepped onto the porch, taking a moment to examine the neighborhood. Across the street, an old man with a cane watched her intently from his window. She gave a polite nod. He twitched the curtain shut. Everywhere she looked, people were peeking from behind closed doors, afraid to be seen. That told her everything she needed to know about the stranglehold the precinct had on the community. By noon, Ebony was in a small cafe near City Hall, sipping a coffee that tasted like burnt water. The place was nearly empty. She spotted a police cruiser parked across the street, an officer inside eyeing her through the window. She made a show of ignoring him, though her pulse thrummed with readiness. Over the next hour, she scoured local news articles on her phone, searching for any mention of Redwood Falls PD corruption. She found a few references to suspicious in-custody deaths, each brushed off by official statements claiming drug health issues or accidental injury. It was all too neat, too familiar. She clenched her jaw as she pictured the smug face of Mason Hayes, the indifference of his colleagues. This was bigger than one or two rogue cops. She overheard quiet voices from a booth behind her. The last person who filed a complaint vanished. Rumor is they left town in a hurry. A second voice responded. No, I heard they tried to fight it in court. Never made it to the hearing. Ebony listened, body rigid with tension. So that was the rumor mill. Fear circulated like currency in Redwood Falls. Her father's old friend, Frank Owens, worked at City Hall, so Ebony decided to pay him a visit. She remembered him as a gentle man who'd been kind to her after her mother died. If anyone would speak truth, it might be Frank. The receptionist at City Hall gave Ebony a suspicious glance, but eventually pointed her to Frank's office in the basement. The corridors smelled of cleaning supplies and stale bureaucracy. Piles of paper towered on old metal desks. A flickering fluorescent light made the entire space feel on edge. Frank was a wiry man in his 60s, hunched over a stack of binders when Ebony knocked softly on his office door. He looked up, surprise evident in his tired eyes. "Ebony?" He stood, offering a hesitant hug. "It's me," she said, trying to force a small smile. "I'm here for Dad's funeral. Came by hoping we could talk." She let the subtext hang. There was more to her visit than just condolences. Frank nodded gravely. "I was sorry to hear. He was a good man." He gestured for her to sit, then closed the door. "Place is a mess these days. Sorry if it's not the welcome you expected." Ebony shrugged. "I've seen worse overseas, but I never thought I'd see it here." Frank leaned back, clasping his hands. "I'm guessing you've had a run-in with our finest?" He sighed when she nodded. "I tried to warn your father about them. He never listened, but he hated what Redwood Falls was becoming." She leaned in. "Why doesn't anyone do something? Everyone's so scared." Frank's eyes shifted to the door, as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Because they have the mayor in their pocket, the judges, half the council, anyone who tries to stand against them. Well, you've seen how they handle dissent." He paused, voice dropping to a whisper. "I've heard stories, Ebony. People beaten in their own homes, families threatened, evidence planted. One woman ended up in prison for allegedly assaulting an officer, but everyone knew she was nowhere near that incident." Ebony's stomach churned. "Have you tried reporting it to state authorities? The FBI?" Frank laughed bitterly. "You think we haven't? Complaints disappear, or the precinct scrambles to discredit whoever complains. It's like hitting a brick wall." His voice trembled with frustration. "I keep a file, though. Clippings, notes, anything that might help one day if someone bigger steps in." Her mind raced. "Could I see it?" He hesitated, eyes darting to the closed door. "It's in my desk, but Ebony, if they find out I showed you, I'm done for." She placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "I know how to keep secrets, Frank. I just need a lead." He nodded slowly, rummaging through a drawer. He pulled out a thin folder with a rubber band around it. Inside were newspaper clippings about Redwood Falls PD controversies, a few typed statements from anonymous witnesses, and references to suspicious financial transactions involving city officials. Ebony skimmed them, heart pounding. "This is bigger than I expected." Frank nodded, voice low. "Your father was close to digging deeper. He wanted to talk to some federal watchdog group, but then, well, he passed. The sorrow in Frank's eyes suggested he feared her father's death might not have been entirely natural. She carefully returned the folder. "Do you have any idea who's at the top of it all?" Frank's voice dropped to a bare whisper. "Police Chief Campbell. He's the spider at the center of this web. Hayes might be his muscle, but Campbell's the one who's kept Redwood Falls under his thumb." Ebony clenched her fists under the desk. She recalled the smirk on Hayes's face. Now she had a name to go with it: Chief Campbell. "Thank you, Frank," she said softly. "I won't forget this." He replaced the folder in the drawer, eyes full of worry. "Be careful, Ebony, I mean it." She left City Hall with her mind churning. Corruption that reached the top, an entire city living in fear, and she was just one person. But if there was one thing Ebony West knew how to do, it was to dismantle oppressive systems. She'd spent her career doing exactly that on foreign soil, leading covert ops against warlords and dictators. Redwood Falls might be smaller in scope, but it operated on the same principle: intimidation, control, and violence. That night, Ebony stayed in her father's house. Despite the dust and loneliness, it felt more secure than the motel, where police cruisers seemed to prowl the parking lot. She set up a small perimeter of makeshift alarms, simple tricks she'd learned during her Delta Force days, like thread tied to tin cans near doors and windows. If someone tried to break in, she'd know. She spent hours compiling her own notes, cross-referencing them with the clippings Frank had shown her: names, dates, rumored payoffs, suspicious arrests. She recognized a pattern. Certain officers always appeared in these problematic arrests: Hayes, Jefferson, and a man named Fuller. Each time, the suspect was either a vocal critic of the department or a business owner who had refused to pay protection money. Around midnight, she glimpsed headlights sweeping across the living room walls. A car slowed outside, lingering for a minute before driving on. She kept the lights off, quietly moving to the window. In the faint glow of a street lamp, she saw a black SUV rolling past. No police markings, but her gut told her it was them. They were scouting, letting her know she was being watched. The next morning, Ebony visited the Redwood Falls Public Library, an old brick building with a stoic woman at the front desk who barely acknowledged her presence. Ebony asked to use the public computers. She spent the next 2 hours digging through property records, financial disclosures, anything she could link to Police Chief Campbell or his known associates. It was slow, tedious work. But every nugget of data confirmed the rumor. Campbell and his circle had stakes in local businesses through shell companies, funneling money from protection fees and other shady deals. As she exited the library, Ebony nearly collided with Officer Hayes, who leaned casually against a nearby lamppost, arms folded. He wore civilian clothes, but his posture screamed cop. She stiffened. "You researching something, Commander West?" He said it like a challenge. "Public library's a great place to dig up old skeletons." Ebony's heart quickened, but her voice remained cold. "Just catching up on Redwood Falls history." He took a step closer. "You know, you don't belong here. It's cute you think you're some hero, but we have eyes everywhere. Ears, too. If you were smart, you'd pack your bags and leave." She tilted her head, letting a dangerous edge seep into her tone. "Or what?" He flashed that smug grin again. "Or your little war hero reputation won't mean much when you're sitting in a cell for assaulting an officer, or distribution of narcotics, or resisting arrest. Take your pick." Ebony's entire being bristled, but she forced herself to remain calm. "If I see you harass one more innocent person," she said quietly, "I will make sure you regret it." Hayes chuckled. "Is that a threat?" "A promise," Ebony replied, stepping around him. She felt his gaze burning into her back as she walked away. Every muscle in her body tensed, expecting him to try something, but he just let her go, probably confident that Redwood Falls PD had the upper hand. The entire system was rigged in their favor, from the courthouse to the mayor's office. All Ebony had was her training, her principles, and a burning fury that wouldn't let her stand aside. By the time she reached the diner near the edge of town, Ebony's anger was a storm in her chest. She slid into a booth, scanning the sparse clientele. The waitress, a weary woman in her 50s, approached with a menu. Ebony ordered a black coffee and sat in silence, her mind spinning with possibilities. She could try to contact the FBI directly. But she'd need solid proof, or Redwood Falls PD would bury her with false charges. Then there was the question of who else was in on it. If the mayor and judges were compromised, would the FBI field office be any different? One misstep, and she could end up rotting in a cell, like so many others. The diner door creaked open, and in walked the young man she'd rescued. Shane. He spotted her, relief flooding his features. Ebony waved him over. "Are you okay?" she asked as he slid into the seat across from her. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. "Not really," he admitted, glancing around nervously. "They came by my house last night, asked my family if I'd been hanging out with any suspicious individuals. My mom was terrified." Ebony's chest tightened. "I'm sorry," she said softly, wishing she could protect everyone all at once. "It won't be like this forever, I promise." Shane nodded, wiping at his eyes. "People keep telling me not to stir the pot. But I'm so tired of living in fear. I've been writing about this on my blog, but hardly anyone sees it. The local press won't touch it. They're all in the pocket of the precinct or the mayor's office." Ebony reached out and gently squeezed his hand. "You're doing the right thing. I'm trying to gather evidence too. Maybe we can combine what we have and send it to the right people." He swallowed, voice trembling. "I'm in, whatever it takes." They spoke in hushed tones for the next hour, trading information, making a plan to document every incident they could. Ebony would gather any evidence from her father's notes, from Frank, and from any other leads. Shane would scan and upload them to secure cloud storage. If they faced intimidation, they'd have multiple backups. Her phone vibrated. Another unknown message. "Your father's death wasn't an accident. Dig deeper." Ebony felt her stomach drop. She'd suspected, but seeing it in text form was a punch to the gut. She showed Shane, who looked horrified. "You think that they killed him?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Ebony's jaw clenched. "I don't know, but I'm going to find out." The waitress passed by, refilling their coffees without a word. Shane stared at the chipped Formica tabletop like it held the answers they needed. Outside, a police cruiser rolled by slowly, as though keeping vigil. The next day, Ebony had an idea. Redwood Falls Daily, the local newspaper. She doubted the paper itself would publish anything critical of the police, but maybe one of the junior reporters was desperate enough to blow the whistle. She found the address in the phone book and walked there in the drizzling afternoon rain. The building was a small, nondescript brick structure. Inside, half the desks were empty. A bored receptionist directed her to a man named Liam Booker, an investigative journalist with a reputation for stirring up trouble. Though Ebony doubted Redwood Falls let him stir much. Booker was a tall, thin man in his early 30s, with glasses perched on a narrow nose. He looked up from his computer as Ebony approached, curiosity lighting up his eyes when she introduced herself. "I'm looking into allegations of corruption at Redwood Falls PD," she said bluntly. "I heard you're the guy who might actually care." His gaze flicked around the room, then he gestured for her to sit. "Funny you should mention that. I wrote a piece on them about a year ago, got spiked by the editor, said it was unsubstantiated, but I had statements from multiple witnesses." Ebony leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Could you revisit it if I provide you with new evidence?" Booker snorted. "I can try, but the editor, Jill Martinez, is petrified of Chief Campbell. She's had friendly warnings from City Hall. I ended up with a pay cut after I insisted on publishing. But if you've got something rock solid, maybe we can bypass the local press entirely." She nodded. "I do. And more is coming. The question is, do you have the guts to release it? Maybe on social media, to national outlets, anywhere Redwood Falls can't silence it?" Booker gave a wry smile. "Lady, I've been waiting for something like this. I'm on board, but you should know what you're risking. They don't just ruin reputations here, they ruin lives." Ebony's gaze hardened. "They picked the wrong soldier to mess with." They exchanged contact info. Booker handed over some old files from his previous attempt, notes from interviews with anonymous victims, references to sealed court documents. Ebony spent an hour scanning them. The threads all pointed to the same spider in the center, Chief Campbell, with help from Mason Hayes and a handful of others. Redwood Falls' entire power structure hinged on this tight-knit circle of crooked officials. Just as Ebony was about to leave, Booker's phone rang. He answered, listened for a few seconds, then nodded, shooting Ebony a concerned look. He hung up and whispered, "That was a tip. The precinct's planning a major bust tonight at Riverside Apartments. Word is they're going after a group they claim is dealing drugs, but my source says it's just an excuse to raid the place because some tenants are behind on their payments." Ebony felt a cold fury spark in her chest. "Are you going to cover it?" He shook his head. "They won't let journalists anywhere near it, but maybe you could." She didn't let him finish. "Text me the address. I'll be there." Outside, the rain had turned to a steady drizzle. Ebony marched through puddles, phone buzzing in her hand as Booker's text came through with the location, Riverside Apartments. She didn't have a plan, but she knew one thing. She had to witness what happened and gather hard evidence. Nightfall came quickly. Ebony dressed in dark clothes and made her way to Riverside on foot, blending into the shadows. She found a vantage point across the street, behind a cluster of overgrown bushes near an abandoned lot. At around 10 p.m., 2 police SUVs screeched to a halt in front of the building. Officers poured out, guns at the ready. Hayes was among them. They kicked down a door on the ground floor, shouting for everyone to get on the floor. Screams echoed in the hallway. Ebony's heart pounded. She filmed with her phone from a distance, the zoom grainy but enough to capture the chaos. A woman's voice rang out, protesting that there were children inside. The officers stormed through anyway. Moments later, Ebony heard a child crying, a woman sobbing. The cops dragged out 3 men, cuffing them roughly. She recognized one of them as a local store clerk she'd seen earlier that week. The men were thrown onto the ground outside, the officers barking accusations of drug possession. Ebony heard Hayes's cruel laugh as he pulled small bags of white powder from his vest pocket, planting them on the scene. Rage and nausea twisted in Ebony's gut. This was exactly the kind of brutality she'd come to Redwood Falls hoping she wouldn't see. She kept filming, every detail fueling her determination. The men shouted their innocence, but the cops drowned them out with threats. One officer jabbed a rifle butt into the store clerk's ribs. Ebony's nails bit into her palms. By the time the raid ended, 6 residents were hauled off in cuffs, wailing children left behind in hysterics. One of the older women kept pleading, "They didn't do anything," over and over, until an officer slapped her across the face. Ebony's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to intervene, but she also knew this footage would be more damning if the corrupt officers had no clue they were being watched. At last, the SUVs roared away into the night. Ebony emerged from her hiding spot, phone in hand, adrenaline still surging. She rushed to check on the older woman who'd been struck. A neighbor was tending to her in the hallway, tears streaming down both their faces. Ebony crouched next to them. "I'm so sorry," she murmured, voice trembling with anger. "They took my son," the older woman spat through bloody lips. "He doesn't even smoke, let alone deal. They planted that stuff on him. I saw it with my own eyes." Ebony pressed a trembling hand to her forehead. "We have proof," she said, voice solemn. "We'll get him out." She spent the next hour comforting frightened residents, taking statements. People were hesitant to talk, but once they saw Ebony's unshakable resolve, they began to share details. How the precinct demanded monthly fees from tenants. How those who couldn't pay were targeted with bogus charges. How they lived in constant fear of the next raid. Back at her father's house, Ebony uploaded the footage to multiple secure locations, labeling the files carefully. She typed out a detailed account of everything she witnessed, then forwarded the material to Liam, Booker, and Shane. "Spread this everywhere," she wrote. "We go big or we go nowhere." Shane responded almost immediately. "OMG, this is insane. I'll post on every platform." Booker's reply came minutes later. "I'm contacting national outlets. Stay safe." Ebony wanted to crash, her body buzzing with exhaustion, but she forced herself to stay awake. She needed to be prepared for retaliation, which she knew would come. Sure enough, around 3 a.m. a thunderous pounding on her father's front door jolted her upright. She grabbed her phone and a small stun gun she tucked under the couch. Heart hammering, she peered through the blinds. Two officers, armed and fuming, stood on the porch. She recognized them from the raid, Fuller and Jefferson. "We know you're in there," Fuller shouted. "Open up, West." She debated ignoring them, but they'd probably break the door down. Ebony squared her shoulders, remembering who she was. Commander Ebony West, the deadliest Delta Force operator. She could handle a couple of goons. She opened the door, keeping it chained. "It's 3 a.m., she said coolly. "What do you want?" Jefferson shoved the door, rattling the chain. "Cut the crap, we know you filmed the raid." Ebony remained calm. "Filmed what raid? You want to come in here without a warrant?" Fuller sneered, pushing his face closer to the gap in the door. "If you think you can post that trash online and not face consequences, you're dead wrong. Hand over every piece of footage or we'll charge you with obstruction of justice." A dark, lethal calm settled over Ebony. "You have no legal grounds to demand that. Now get off my property." Jefferson's hand moved to his gun. "Don't test us. We'll drag you out in cuffs and find a reason, trust me." Ebony set her jaw. "You lay one finger on me and your entire precinct will regret it. I guarantee that footage is already in multiple hands. There's no shutting this down." Fuller let out a furious growl. "You think you can stop us? We run Redwood Falls." Ebony's eyes narrowed. Not for long. They stood there for a tense moment, the chain still holding the door. Then Fuller snorted. "You've been warned." He motioned for Jefferson to follow him, and they stomped off the porch into the darkness. Ebony closed the door, chest heaving, mind ablaze. She was all in now, no going back. The lines were drawn. She had effectively declared war on Redwood Falls PD. She spent the rest of the night dozing fitfully on the couch, stun gun close by, every sound outside making her snap awake, but her resolve held firm. Over the next several days, Ebony's footage went viral. National news outlets picked it up, focusing on the shocking display of brutality. Social media exploded with hashtags condemning Redwood Falls PD, calling for federal intervention. Shane's blog posts circulated widely, racking up thousands of views. Even the Redwood Falls Daily, under pressure from Booker's leaked evidence, published a scathing front-page article about police corruption. Protesters gathered outside City Hall and the precinct building, chanting for Chief Campbell's resignation. But Redwood Falls PD dug in their heels. Official statements claimed Ebony's video was misleading and that the raid was part of a larger investigation into dangerous criminals. They painted Ebony as an unhinged ex-soldier with a vendetta. The mayor, a pale man named Reginald Owens, parroted the same line in a televised press conference. "We stand by our brave officers. This is nothing but a smear campaign by an outsider." Behind the scenes, Ebony coordinated with Shane, Booker, and Frank Owens from City Hall, no relation to the mayor. They compiled every shred of evidence, from forged documents to taped confessions from frightened citizens. Each day, more victims stepped forward, spurred on by Ebony's unstoppable determination. Families of those falsely arrested began filing formal complaints with the help of a local attorney, Anna Fields, who had quietly harbored resentment against the PD for years. Fields brought Ebony a stack of affidavits from imprisoned individuals who claimed Redwood Falls PD planted drugs or coerced confessions. She explained that local judges almost always sided with the police, but maybe with national attention, the tide could turn. Ebony poured over them, her anger mounting at each heartbreaking story. Pressure mounted on Redwood Falls PD. Chief Campbell refused interviews, citing legal constraints, but behind closed doors, Ebony knew they were plotting. She'd spent enough time in clandestine ops to sense a cornered animal about to lash out. One afternoon, Ebony got a call from an unknown number. She hesitated, but answered. "Commander West," a gravelly voice said. "We know what you're doing and we have your father's autopsy report." Her blood went cold. "Who is this?" "That's not important. What matters is that your father's heart attack might not have been so natural. You might want to check the coroner's signature. Let's just say some toxins can mimic cardiac failure." Before she could respond, the line went dead. Ebony's hand shook as she lowered the phone. Could Redwood Falls PD have murdered her father to stop him from exposing their crimes? The realization hit like a bullet. She had to see that autopsy report. She called Frank Owens, who promised to dig into the coroner's files. That night, Ebony paced her father's living room. If they had killed him, it meant Redwood Falls PD was capable of anything. The phone rang again. Frank's number. He sounded breathless, terrified. "You were right," he said. "The official record says heart attack, but I found an earlier draft of the report indicating traces of an unidentified compound in his blood. Then the record was changed. The coroner's a friend of Campbell. Ebony, I'm so sorry." Her vision blurred with grief and fury. "I'll make them pay," she whispered. In the midst of this, the mayor announced a citywide curfew to prevent unrest, giving Redwood Falls PD even more license to roam the streets, harassing anyone out after dark. Ebony heard from multiple residents that cops were using the curfew as an excuse to detain people, search houses, and intimidate potential whistleblowers. Protests intensified, and on a tense Friday evening, Ebony found herself standing outside the precinct building alongside hundreds of demonstrators chanting for justice. Police barricades separated them from the station. Officers in riot gear lined the perimeter. Ebony recognized some of the faces behind those visors: Hayes, Fuller, Jefferson, the same men who'd threatened her. The tension was a live wire, ready to snap. Suddenly, tear gas canisters arced overhead. People screamed, scattering. Ebony resisted the urge to flee. She grabbed a fallen canister and lobbed it back toward the empty street, trying to give the crowd room to breathe. Riot police advanced, batons raised. Ebony's eyes stung from the gas, but she held her ground as the line of armor-clad officers pushed forward, beating protesters. It was chaos, confusion, the type of scene Ebony had witnessed in war-torn regions overseas. But this was an American city. She spotted Shane coughing violently, tears streaming down his face from the gas. She ran to him, pulling him away from a swinging baton just in time. They dashed behind a parked car, gasping for air. "Why are they doing this?" Shane shouted over the din. Ebony clenched her fists. "Because they can. Because they're losing control, and this is how they respond." Dozens were arrested that night, including some journalists. Ebony and Shane narrowly evaded capture by slipping into a nearby alley. Sirens wailed, and acrid clouds of tear gas hung in the air. Redwood Falls was at a breaking point. In the days that followed, Ebony ramped up her plan. She reached out to national civil rights organizations, high-profile lawyers, and even a congresswoman known for tackling police reform. Evidence flooded her from residents who were finally finding the courage to speak. Meanwhile, Redwood Falls PD escalated their campaign of intimidation. Unknown cars tailed Ebony wherever she went. Flyers appeared around town labeling her a dangerous agitator and fraud. Late one evening, Ebony received a text from an unsaved number. "Get out of Redwood Falls or your father's death will be the first of many in your family." Her hands trembled. She had no living siblings, no children, but the threat spoke volumes. They were desperate, and Ebony knew desperate people took desperate measures. She forwarded the text to Booker and Anna Fields. A few hours later, a national investigative TV program announced it would air a segment on Redwood Falls PD, featuring Ebony's footage and interviews with local victims. Campbell and his cronies had to realize the net was closing. At City Hall, the mayor publicly feigned ignorance of the precinct's corruption, claiming he was shocked by the allegations. Ebony observed from the back of the press room, bitterness filling her gut. She knew he was lying. Frank Owens had shown her documents linking the mayor to shady real estate deals with the police union. It was all connected. Then came the final straw. Ebony learned that Redwood Falls PD was planning a massive raid on a community center where activists were meeting. She was tipped off by a sympathetic officer who claimed to be sick of the corruption. The raid was set for the following night under the guise of searching for narcotics. Ebony felt a sickening certainty that this was a move to crush the protest movement for good, to break the spirit of anyone who dared fight back. She called Anna Fields, who quickly filed for an injunction, but the local judge, one of Campbell's puppets, refused to sign. It was an old story. Redwood Falls was a closed loop of corruption. Ebony needed to break it from the outside with overwhelming force. So she made the riskiest call of her life. She contacted a friend in the Department of Justice from her military days. He owed her a favor, and while he couldn't deploy federal agents on a whim, he could at least set wheels in motion for a preliminary federal investigation. She also reached out to national news organizations, urging them to come to Redwood Falls in force, cameras rolling. The night of the planned raid, Ebony positioned herself on the roof of a building across from the community center. She wore dark clothing, phone in hand to record everything. Inside the center, activists gathered. Families, students, elderly folks, local business owners. They were holding a peaceful meeting, discussing ways to file civil suits against the city. Ebony's gut twisted at the thought of the police storming in. Sure enough, just after 9 p.m., a convoy of 5 police vehicles pulled up, lights flashing but sirens off. She zoomed in with her phone camera, capturing them. Hayes and Fuller were at the helm, stepping out with rifles. They approached the center's entrance, while the other officers fanned out around the building. Ebony recognized them, the same group that had terrorized Riverside Apartments. She clicked record. The tension below was palpable. Then, without warning, the police used a battering ram on the community center doors, smashing the glass. Screams erupted from inside. Officers tossed in flashbangs. Ebony caught everything on video, heart hammering in her chest. This was a blatant assault on civilians practicing their First Amendment rights. But Redwood Falls PD didn't realize one crucial detail. National news vans were rolling up the street at that very moment, cameras blazing, tipped off by Ebony's desperate calls. And right behind them were a handful of state troopers who had been alerted to the potential illegal raid. The troopers parked, stepping out with an air of cautious authority. The media lights illuminated the chaos in a harsh glare. Caught in the spotlight, Hayes froze, rifle in hand, half inside the community center. Residents stumbled out, coughing from the flashbang residue. Some had minor injuries. The troopers approached, cautioning Redwood Falls officers to stand down. Officers like Hayes and Fuller looked stunned, as though they'd never expected anyone to witness their routine brutality. Ebony filmed from above, capturing their confusion. A trooper took charge, demanding to see a warrant. Hayes stuttered, rummaging for a piece of paper. The trooper examined it and shook his head. "This isn't signed by a judge. This is worthless." In the confusion, Ebony climbed down the fire escape and joined the crowd of reporters who had formed a ring around the confrontation. The troopers were ordering Redwood Falls PD to disarm and back away. Some Redwood officers complied reluctantly, lowering their rifles. Others, like Hayes, looked ready to snap. Ebony slipped closer, phone still recording. Suddenly, Hayes recognized her. In a moment of blind rage, he lunged forward, raising his rifle. Ebony reacted with the speed and precision that had earned her the nickname, the Deadliest Delta Force Commander. She struck the rifle's barrel upward, then delivered a lightning-fast blow to his forearm. He howled in pain, losing grip on the weapon. The cameras captured everything. Before Hayes could recover, Ebony pinned him to the ground, using a precise joint lock that left him immobilized, face contorted in agony. Nearby reporters gasped, the troopers stunned momentarily, before they rushed in to cuff the disgraced officer. In that moment, Ebony West epitomized righteous fury, the unstoppable soldier fighting for justice on her own soil. The crowd erupted in cheers, a catharsis for years of oppression. The raid collapsed. Officers who had followed Hayes and Fuller stood down, some dropping their weapons in shame. The media coverage was instantaneous. Police attempt raid on community center, met by state troopers and national press. Ebony's footage, combined with the on-the-ground reporting, tore through social media like wildfire. Calls for a federal investigation escalated, and the governor publicly demanded that Chief Campbell step aside. Over the next 48 hours, Redwood Falls PD faced an onslaught of external pressure unlike anything in its history. The Department of Justice announced a preliminary inquiry, sending federal agents to secure evidence from the precinct. Chief Campbell tried to hide, barricading himself in his office, but a federal warrant forced the doors open. They seized computers, files, everything. Booker's articles soared to national prominence, painting Redwood Falls as a microcosm of systemic corruption in small-town America. Meanwhile, Ebony West became an overnight symbol of heroic defiance. Interviews poured in, but she stayed focused on the real goal: dismantling the corrupt network. Shane, Anna Fields, Frank Owens, and many others played their parts, providing documents, statements, and testimonies to the newly arrived federal agents. The avalanche of evidence was undeniable. In a final showdown, Chief Campbell was escorted out of the precinct in handcuffs, flanked by federal marshals. His last act of defiance was to spew threats at reporters. But the system he had lorded over was crumbling. Officers like Hayes, Fuller, and Jefferson faced charges ranging from assault and battery to conspiracy and extortion. Judges who had rubber-stamped false warrants were put under investigation. The mayor resigned in disgrace when financial records linked him to secret offshore accounts. When the dust began to settle, Ebony stood on the steps of the courthouse, exhausted but triumphant. Shane was there, streaming live on social media. Anna Fields and Frank Owens joined them, while a crowd gathered to celebrate the arrests that signaled a new beginning for Redwood Falls. It wasn't just about locking up a few bad cops. It was about rebuilding a community that had been terrorized for years. One by one, local residents approached Ebony, thanking her. Some brought homemade signs with messages like, "Thank you, Commander West," and "Finally free." Ebony's eyes misted at the outpouring of gratitude. She felt a hand on her shoulder. Frank's. He offered a weak, relieved smile. "You did it," he said. "You actually did it." Ebony shook her head. "We did it. All of us." The months that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings. Ebony testified in multiple trials, detailing what she had witnessed and what she had uncovered. Shane's blog became a hub for community discussions on reform. Anna Fields worked tirelessly to get wrongfully convicted individuals released. Booker's exposés earned him a National Journalism Award. Redwood Falls slowly began to heal. Though Ebony received offers to speak around the country, she spent much of her time in Redwood Falls, helping form a civilian oversight committee. She collaborated with the incoming interim police chief, a reform-minded outsider, on new policies. She even convinced Frank to run for city council, ensuring someone ethical had a hand in guiding Redwood Falls' future. On a crisp autumn day, Ebony finally visited her father's grave again, this time with a sense of closure. She placed a fresh bouquet of flowers against the headstone. The coroner's cover-up had unraveled. It was proven that her father's death was indeed suspicious. The final autopsy results implicated an officer who'd spiked his medication. That officer now faced murder charges. Justice would be served, though it came far too late for her father. She knelt by the grave, whispering, "I'm sorry, Dad. I wish I'd been here sooner. But I hope you can rest knowing Redwood Falls will be a better place." She closed her eyes, letting the wind carry her grief. Then she stood, shoulders squared, a soldier who had won a battle she never asked to fight, but fought nonetheless, with everything she had. In the aftermath, Redwood Falls transformed. The city council approved a complete overhaul of the police department's operating procedures. State and federal oversight committees were formed to monitor high-risk precincts across the country. The Redwood Falls story became a case study in how a single, determined individual could ignite change, especially when supported by a community ready to stand against oppression. Ebony West, no longer just a Delta Force commander, became a symbol for anyone who'd ever been told they were powerless. She had confronted a fortress of corruption and emerged victorious, not because she was invincible, but because she was willing to shine a light into the darkest corners. When asked by a national news anchor what kept her going, Ebony had only one answer: you can't unsee injustice once you've witnessed it. And for every father, mother, child who can't fight back, someone has to stand in the gap. In the final weeks before she returned to Army duty, this time in a more strategic role that allowed her to continue advocating for justice, Ebony attended a community forum in Redwood Falls. The newly appointed chief of police, a woman named Teresa Adams, stood at the front of the town hall, fielding questions. Ebony watched from the back, a quiet sense of hope blooming in her chest. No more fear haunted the residents. Hands shot up, voices rang out, and the conversation was vibrant, open, honest. At the end of the forum, Ebony slipped out a side door, not eager for more publicity. But she stopped short when she saw Shane waiting on the sidewalk, holding a small pamphlet. "Commander," he called, a wide grin on his face. "They're naming the community center after your father." Ebony's breath caught. "My father?" Shane nodded, eyes shining. "They said he fought this corruption as much as he could, and then you carried the torch. It's going to be called the West Memorial Center for Community Empowerment." Ebony felt tears threaten. She took the pamphlet, seeing her father's photo printed there in black and white. "He deserved better," she said softly. "But I'm glad his name will stand for something good." Shane offered a small salute, the gesture awkward but heartfelt. Ebony pulled him into a quick hug. "Thank you," she whispered, voice thick with emotion. As she walked away, Ebony reflected on the months of turmoil and the price that had been paid by so many innocent people. She had stepped off a plane, expecting to bury her father, only to uncover a network of darkness. Yet out of that darkness came a light that refused to be snuffed out. Redwood Falls would heal, and perhaps Ebony West would too. In time. On her last day in town, she visited the newly renamed community center. Kids played basketball on a freshly painted court. Volunteers organized food drives in an adjacent room. A mural on the far wall depicted clasped hands breaking chains, the word freedom painted in bold letters above them, and just below, in smaller script, was a quote from Ebony's father. "A uniform should protect, not oppress." She traced the words gently, letting herself feel the weight of all that had been lost and gained. Then she walked out into the sunlight, duffel bag over her shoulder, heading to the airport to catch a flight back to her posting. As she left Redwood Falls behind, Ebony carried with her not just the scars of battle, but the profound truth that one person can indeed change an entire community. The hardest fights are often the ones we never see coming, and the greatest victories are those won on the home front, for the people who need it most. She never did find absolute peace about her father's death, but she found purpose, and for Ebony West, that was enough. Because in Redwood Falls, justice hadn't just arrived, it had taken root. And in every city with a crooked badge or a rigged courtroom, people whispered her name, remembering how the deadliest Delta Force commander taught a small town the true meaning of bravery. Sometimes, the strongest weapon against a corrupt system is the unshakable resolve of a single soul determined to set things right. That is how Redwood Falls found its rebirth, and how Commander Ebony West honored her father's memory by bringing justice to a place that believed it was beyond saving. Yet this story holds more than just the triumph of one woman over a crooked precinct. It carries lessons for every reader who has ever seen injustice and wondered what difference one person can make. First, it reminds us that speaking up is often the first and most crucial step. Silence perpetuates tyranny, and fear is the tool that keeps it in place. By daring to stand, Ebony inspired an entire town to confront the terror that ruled their daily lives. Second, it shows that no system is entirely impenetrable. Even in Redwood Falls, where the mayor, judges, and officers colluded, determined individuals working together, journalists, lawyers, activists, and brave citizens, brought light into the darkest corners. Corruption thrives on secrecy. Once exposed, its foundation begins to crack. Third, the story teaches the power of unity. Ebony's military skills alone wouldn't have toppled the precinct. It took Shane's courage, Frank's knowledge, Anna Fields' legal expertise, Booker's media reach, and the community's voices raised in unison. True change demands collaboration. Finally, it challenges each of us to recognize that heroes aren't always clad in capes or stationed on the front lines of foreign wars. Sometimes, the hero is the daughter who comes home to bury her father and refuses to tolerate the evil she finds there. Sometimes, it's the neighbor who starts filming, the blogger who posts the truth, or the quiet city hall clerk who won't shred another incriminating document. This is the legacy of Commander Ebony West. That one resolute person can light a spark capable of burning down an empire of corruption. And in the ashes of that empire, a new day can dawn, one where justice is not merely a word, but a living, breathing reality. Because in the end, the greatest battles are not fought for land or power, but for the soul of a community, and ultimately, for the soul of us all.